Yeah, so next up for WordCast today, we're going to be talking about some big changes coming to Mac, both software and then some hardware stuff. And I say some hardware stuff
Yeah.
as if that's not the bigger part of this conversation. So I honestly didn't think this was going to happen anytime soon, but Apple announced macOS 11. It's called Big Sur. We are finally moving away from OS X. I've been annoyed with the OS X name since they got past 10.9. Like 10.10 is just, I don't like that naming scheme.
Yeah. Well, and I
Or
mean, I
numeric
mean,
scheme.
let's be honest though, Big Sur is not my favorite name either.
Yeah, but Apple is just messing around at this point. Like they made a joke in the press conference about like drug-fueled trips to come up with names, and they specifically changed their naming scheme a little bit to throw people off. Even though it's not really that big of a naming scheme, it's just named after a place.
I would like to call it macOS.
Big fart.
No.
Yeah. That's
It's just named after a
uh-huh.
state park. Like it's not anything crazy.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
But
there's been enough jokes about it.
yeah. So the biggest thing that makes this for a user experience perspective at least, OS 11 versus 10 is that they have changed the UI a bit. So the biggest thing that stands out for most people is going to be the new icons. They have shifted to a more uniform shape like iOS. In fact, there was I think a lead designer at, I think it was Square, pointed out that the icons would look very good on an iPad because just like iOS icons, they have rounded corners that just so happen to perfectly fit the curve of the display of the iPad Pro.
Well, yeah, and the curve of the body too. The display and body kind of line up that
Yeah,
way.
but I'm just saying like it
So,
fits
yeah, it's just like,
it fits the screen, which also indicates that maybe that's going to be what the next Mac screen does, is have curved edges.
Maybe. Yeah, make a big 10-minute deal about that in their presentation.
I mean,
Look at
based
our
on this
curved edges.
presentation, I don't think they're going to. But we'll see. I mean,
maybe
it seems
so.
like Apple's changing a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
It's quite a bit of change here that we're seeing.
Yeah. So there's the new icons. They're changing some things with the sidebars. So right now in macOS, sidebars are a little inconsistent in visual design, in that for some apps, specifically the older apps, the sidebars height ends when you reach the like top bar panel. So the like let's look at Chrome for example, on Windows. You have that top bar there. Well, the sidebar, if you were to imagine having a sidebar within that, it doesn't go all the way to the top of the app, but rather just to the bottom of that upper bar. Whereas what they're doing in Big Sur is they're changing that UI. They're flattening things out and adding specific like shadows and other design elements, but then they're also making it go all the way to the top consistently, just so that there's a consistent feel among the OS. Because some apps already do that. Some apps already go all the way to the top, and that sidebar integrates with the window controls for opening and closing applications or resizing them. And so it looks a little odd. They're refining that. Some of the more feature-specific changes that they're adding, there's a new control center that is pretty similar to iOS's control center, although they're tweaking the UI to be a bit more optimized for keyboard and mouse. So for those that don't use iOS, if you open the control center, if you change the brightness or the volume, that's through a slider that's very much designed to be touched. So you just go like this. Whereas, normally on a computer, the slider that you might use is like a round icon over a bar. That's what it looks like on macOS, because that makes sense for a computer and a keyboard and mouse interface.
Yeah.
But what's also cool is that they're making it so that you can drag your favorite controls to the top menu bar. So if you want quick access to turn off Wi-Fi or turn off Bluetooth or whatever else you might want to do, you can open the control center and drag the icon up to the top bar of the macOS user interface, and then you have that quick toggle right there.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so it's just like a nice little way to kind of give yourself a little bit more quick access to controls.
I like that. I mean, small changes like that could be really beneficial sometimes.
Yeah, especially since it's something that's some level of user control, and so some people won't care. For some people, it's going to be really helpful though. And then for some people, it's like, oh, I might use it every once in a while.
Right.
And then the other thing is that they are changing Notification Center, and so they are kind of refining notifications a bit, and then they are integrating notifications and widgets into a single panel that you can open up over anything. And these widgets do also look very similar to
Control Center.
No,
Yeah,
they look very similar to the iOS widgets that are coming.
Oh, I see what you were saying.
And that makes sense because iOS and macOS are going to be getting a lot closer in software development side, the side of things, as we will talk about when we talk about the hardware.
Yeah, here in just a little bit.
There's a lot of other updates for macOS Big Sur, although in my opinion, a lot of them are, not a big deal. Like, I mean, we have stuff like iMessages improvements are coming to macOS because you use iMessage on it. Apple Maps' improvements are coming to it.
Of course they are. Yeah.
They're adding Memoji stickers, which makes me think that the next Mac is going to have Face ID, and then also the ability to do emojis. Which if you use those, that's cool. If you don't, then you don't care.
That kind of stuff just like blah, I don't know, bugs me.
Hey, they're adding face masks and emojis, so they're up with the time.
I hate.
Yeah, but you hate fun.
Every time I get one, I hate it.
But you hate fun. I'm gonna send you more emojis now. I hope you realize that.
Why did I say anything? This is a bad decision.
They are also changing how search works. They're improving search even further on Mac, which in my opinion, it was already a pretty good tool. But it's faster, and it now organizes results into a different groups. So it'll have like a specific section for conversations, specific section for links, specific section for photos.
So it's becoming a little more similar in some ways to Windows search, where you can search between apps, the web.
I mean, you already could do that. It's just more so reorganizing how it looks.
Okay.
And then also,
because Windows search has been like a huge thing for me, but I don't use Mac.
Yeah.
Obviously, I do use iPad OS, but not Mac. So I didn't know.
Also, what's cool is that within the search window, let's say you click on a conversation. You can, from what it opens up, launch into the actual iMessage, but by default, it just kind of like if you're searching a message, it'll show everything in a much like cleaner. I'll send you the link so you can show the B-roll, and then for people that are wondering what I'm talking about, they should look at the macOS Big Sur preview on Apple's website and look at the
if you're just listening to the audio version, check it out there.
And look at the messages section in the search that they mentioned. It's much better. But other than that, there's a lot of smaller updates. But the other big thing that I wanted to talk about was the changes coming to Safari. Now, a lot of this stuff is also coming to iOS and iPadOS 14, but I feel like they're more important. And there is more features coming to the Safari version. But so they're adding translation, which Chrome has and other browsers have. It's not uncommon. But they're adding that in, which is nice to have. They're adding in some new privacy reporting features and privacy tracking prevention features.
They look kind of similar to Firefox's, honestly.
Yeah, they're really cool. So by default, Safari has tracking prevention now for anything that's cross-website, and they worked with DuckDuckGo on the like tracking prevention. And then in addition to that, you can very easily see which like sites had tried to track you and what was blocked. And you just have a lot more visuals and a lot more control over the privacy aspects of Safari now, which is very good.
Cool. Yeah.
And then they are doing some nice improvements with extensions for Safari, because Safari's been kind of shit with extensions.
It's been pretty bad. So that's actually something I'm aware of, even though I don't use it.
The most important thing is that they are adding tools for developers to very easily convert Chrome extensions to Safari. thank you,
Oh,
because
okay, that's really
it's
nice. Yeah,
nobody wants to make extensions for Safari because they just why not enough people use it.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's a small
and so
market.
being able to make an extension for Chrome and easily port it over is great. Um, in addition to that, they like extensions on Chrome and extensions on Firefox have already had levels of control over what websites can access extensions.
Yeah,
Safari's kind of making that much more front and center, which I think is a good thing. Again, this goes into Apple is doing some privacy stuff in a way that is designed to just get people aware of it.
yeah.
And so rather than just asking for like permission for an app to or an extension to be used on a website or to be used in general, it's going to ask to be used on websites in certain cases, depending on the extension. And so
Mm-hmm.
that way you won't have like if an extension is gathering data, for example, it'll ask you more regularly. Like it'll ask you if you go to a new site for the first time, if you want to use it, rather than always gathering data on everything you do.
That's good.
So
That's good. And that some of that actually does line up with some of the work that Firefox
yeah,
does
yeah, it's
as
not like
well.
new
So I
things out of
appreciate that.
nowhere. It's good things that needed to be done in Safari.
Yeah, and some of it's things that need to be done in something like Chrome as
Yeah,
well. I mean, Chrome's behind on a lot of that stuff.
Chrome is behind on a lot of things. Um,
I hate Chrome.
and in addition to that, they're adding the ability to find extensions within the macOS App Store, which is good because that's the other thing is that right now there isn't a
Yeah.
consistent unified place to find Safari extensions. It's been a little
Okay.
bit
That's
more of a
nice
pain in
then.
the ass, whereas like Chrome has their Chrome Web Store, stuff
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Um,
And the Chrome Web Store works on any even non-Chrome browser as long as it's Chromium based.
yes,
You can go there
yeah.
and install stuff. So
And then they're doing some password monitoring stuff. So while you should be using a dedicated password manager and not any of the ones that are built into your browser,
yeah.
they are, if you are utilizing um, Apple's password management system, they are integrating something so that if any of your passwords get breached, it'll notify you. Um,
So
yes.
Firefox.
Um,
Firefox does the same thing as
yeah.
well. So that actually I like seeing this though because there are a huge amount of reasons that I use Firefox over literally everything else, and seeing that come to the default browser on something is nice.
Yes.
Seeing some of those features come to something that a normal user might actually come across
Yeah.
is good.
Like the people that use Firefox generally use it either because they've just used it for years or specifically because of a lot of this stuff. And
Right, they're a power user of some
yeah,
sort and are more knowledgeable about this kind of normal tech stuff, and Chrome is just so limited at this point. I feel like in comparison to some of the stuff that you can do in Firefox or even now Safari.
yeah. And then the other stuff, so they're further improving battery life from what it already has been on Safari or on macOS, which, from my understanding, it was already one of the best browsers on macOS for obvious reasons as far as battery life goes.
Yeah,
It's really easy for Apple to
yeah.
optimize that. Um, but Apple is claiming now 3 hours more of video streaming battery life compared to Chrome or Firefox.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so me, I would still use Firefox. It's the most cross-platform
Well,
browser,
and then on
but
top of that, Mac's battery
whew,
life is already good enough. Like 3 hours is fantastic, and if you need it, that's amazing.
mm-hmm.
But like it's
But
already
Max
good enough
lasts
that you don't really need it for
pretty much
most
a whole
users.
day.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, right.
and then
And that's gonna change too. That's gonna improve.
yeah, and then for general web browsing, which actually, for those that don't know, does often take up much more battery than video.
Yeah.
It's 1 hour more of browsing compared to Chrome or Firefox.
Okay.
So
Cool. That's good.
overall, it's just a battery improvement compared to where things have been, and it's now solidifying them as on macOS the best for battery life in specific.
Yeah.
Assuming that this holds up, which even the dev preview you can't really count on. We have to wait until it launches.
Right. Of
Um,
course. Yeah.
and then the last thing with Safari, they are for the default start page that exists, making it more customizable, which is helpful.
That's
So,
useful, and I think a good addition. So yeah.
and that's really it for Mac OS. This is the more important thing that was announced, though. Apple
Yeah.
is Apple has announced that they are moving away from not just Intel for their Mac products, but from x86 altogether. They are moving to
Whew.
ARM architecture for their computing stack.
And this is a little insane. I mean, we expected it at some point, but this is, I mean, there is so much that this entails, and and to be honest, chances are the transition initially is going to be rough, but they were when PowerPC switched over to x86. It was.
I
Rough.
think it's going to be
Now,
better
that was a while back, but
I think it's going to be much better than that transition. I do think it's still going to be rough, but it's going to be much better than that transition. So, few things. For one, Apple's been through the transition before. They know what to have dealt with, and they know what to look for and target as far as making this easier.
This is true. Yep.
So they're planning on finishing this transition from a hardware standpoint of just releasing hardware within 2 years. Obviously, it's going to take a lot longer than that for some apps to get updated.
Yeah, well, yeah, and you have to be careful too because they still have to have some level of support from the OS itself for things like Mac Pros. Who, if somebody just spent 30 grand on a Mac Pro, they can't let that
and
die
even
off
then,
in 2
it's
years,
not like Apple's going to stop supporting the current gen MacBook Pro in 2 years. That's not what Apple does.
Right, yeah.
And it's much easier to run ARM applications on x86 than it is to run x86 applications on ARM.
Yes,
and so it's much
this
easier for them to do their own translation without really needing much effort, whereas translating x86 to ARM is a pretty big deal. However,
I can't remember what it is. I think it's like a 4x increase in necessary clock cycles to emulate emulate x86 on ARM.
Correct. Now,
so you waste like 4 times.
ARM also is generally more efficient than per clock cycle than x86, and so it's not like it's taking like 4 times as long to run programs. It's just definitely nowhere near as efficient. However, Apple is doing some pretty interesting things with the Rosetta 2 translation layer. So Rosetta is what they used before with the PowerPC to Intel transition, and Rosetta 2 is new. The biggest thing I think is that whenever possible, depending on the application, it actually does the translation at install time, not runtime. So it's not constantly running this translation. It just installs and makes it work.
Yeah, it was just recompiling it, which is understandable. That's a good approach because as we've seen, trying to emulate even x86 on ARM, which trying to emulate x86 stuff on ARM, we've seen with Microsoft to do that live has been a real hassle. It has not been
correct.
Great.
Very correct. It's been a mess.
Oh yeah.
The one thing though that I think kind of changes things that I just thought of, and I haven't seen anybody else talk about in all of this. There's a lot better understanding of how to get high performance stuff running well on ARM. Now, obviously, the thing that I'm going to talk about is very specific to NVIDIA hardware, but it's still ARM. The Nintendo Switch. It's an ARM-based chip that is running games that were all very much so designed for x86 hardware because PS4, Xbox One, and PC are all x86.
Yeah.
And they have been able to get very high performance games. Obviously, they have to downgrade the games a lot because it's not even a high-end ARM chip. But the fact that we are seeing games like Witcher work at all on Switch
is really impressive.
It's really impressive. It shows that developers have learned, like, not macOS developers necessarily, but the techniques are out there now to do this better than we've seen before. And obviously, there hasn't been a push by Microsoft to really do this, especially since the Switch launch. We saw them release an ARM computers a while ago, but they just didn't really put much effort into it.
No, and they have since released another one, I believe, but they still don't seem to be doing a ton of work on it.
And so I feel like we're gonna see a faster, for one, a faster transition software wise to this than we did from PowerPC to Intel. And I think that
Yeah.
we're going to see developers be able to get more performance out of it faster. But let's talk about the hardware because that's what's interesting. So initially what we're seeing, the only hardware announcement that we have is the developer transition kit, which again, this is something they did previously. Um, but in
Yeah.
this case, it's essentially a Mac Mini running the A12Z Bionic, which is the chip found in the iPad, though obviously it has less thermal constraints and less power constraints because it's in a different form factor that's designed for this. So it's going to run better. It's got 16 gigs of RAM, a 512 gig SSD. The rest of that stuff doesn't really matter as much as what processor's in it, I feel like. Um,
Yeah, agreed.
but this
And
is,
that kind of stuff can
yeah.
change too.
Well, and this
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
the A12Z is not going to be what we see in even the first Mac laptop running this. This is just to
Oh
get
yeah,
developers
absolutely.
up to speed with getting their code working well on ARM that don't already
Yeah.
make stuff for iOS devices. Because the
Right.
goal that Apple has is universal apps. They want one code base. Obviously, you have to design the UIs differently for each product, but one like
Yeah.
core code base for Mac, iPad, and iPhone, and WatchOS and everything
And
else.
there's not just a user-friendly aspect to that that's kind of blaringly obvious, but there's more that can play into that as well. So it's more data efficient
Yeah,
to have it that way, right? So Apple's data centers don't have to store as much if all of the apps are smaller aside from UI changes for each
yeah,
device,
and it's
right?
also easier
And that kind of
for
stuff.
developers. If you have to build, let's say you want to build a browser. If you have to build a browser that's optimized for ARM and then another browser that's optimized for x86, that's a lot of
Yeah.
work. If you can just build one browser that's optimized for ARM, that's much easier to put in more optimization for.
Yeah.
Apps will be
Yeah.
able to
And
better
more
take,
efficient coding.
you know, with smaller teams at least, you'll be able to better take advantage of the hardware by just focusing. And this is the console advantage, really, of focusing
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
one architecture. Now, obviously, there's multiple different power levels, but being able
Right,
to go
right, yeah.
all in on ARM is going to be helpful.
I think so
Um,
too, and I think it's a good move for really portable
yeah.
machines.
What
Um,
I'm
the desktop side is what I'm like.
Yeah, now I'm interested to see though what Apple can pull off with that because based on what they've shown with the imagery that they used, they're designing chips specifically for laptop and specifically for desktop. It does not look like what we're
Yeah,
going to get is A12Z across the stack, A13 across the stack, which
yeah,
is what they do
yeah,
for mobile is they have, their current A series chip is generally what we see across their entire mobile stack. But their
yeah.
mobile
Or
stack is
potentially a upclocked version of it on some of the
Yeah,
higher end
but like their
devices. Yeah,
mobile stack is generally all pretty similarly thermal constrained and power constrained because they're running mobile
yeah.
devices on smaller batteries, and even just on battery in general. Whereas when you look at what we might see from an iMac, we've never seen an ARM chip designed for desktop. We've seen ARM chips designed for data centers, and they can do some great things.
Oh
But
yeah, yeah, and they can clock pretty high too when they have the ability to do
Yeah.
so.
And so we've
Yeah,
never seen someone go all out in designing an ARM chip for desktop. And I can't wait to see what that is just because that'll give us a better idea of if ARM is long term maybe it is a viable option that we just have never gotten the chance to really try for desktop. We don't know.
yeah.
And obviously, the translation stuff requires extra clock cycles, but maybe long term ARM could end up being a better architecture. Maybe it won't be. We have no idea because we've never really had
Well,
that comparison in
yeah.
that space.
Well, it also though. Okay, so the bigger thing I see is that it's just it depends on the end goal of the product, and the end goal of a lot of Apple's products is user simplicity and single
Mhm.
ecosystem, and that is where you can have an advantage from having both the same instruction set across the stack, but also just having the you can optimize for that sort of thing. And so it's not even so much that ARM is necessarily, the better solution for desktop. It's that it's a different solution for desktop that makes more sense in an Apple-like ecosystem versus Linux or Windows, where the goal is to be compatible and be able to do as many things as possible.
Yeah.
Right? Like Windows as an OS can do more than any OS, period. And Linux guys will argue with that, but guess what? Linux on Windows, right? So like, and sure, the subsystem, Windows subsystem for Linux is not as good as full Linux, but also you have virtual machines and stuff, of course. But the point is that Apple's goal is not make Mac do literally everything. It's make Mac do the things that most people would use it for really, really, really well, and make it so that people know that going into it. You buy a Mac because or an iPad because you know what you want to do with it.
But what I was trying to get at with the processor side is like, what if, I mean, obviously we don't know. And again, it could end up just not being better. But what if Apple ends up coming out with an ARM chip for iMac that is better than what we see running on, Windows machines?
Well, you're talking pure performance.
Yeah, because much weaker clock speed and everything chips on like iPad outperform the stuff we see in the lower end Macs.
This is true, and you can even compare them to tablets from Windows and stuff that are running x86 chips.
Yeah, and like we've never seen really we've never seen ARM Unleashed is what I'll say in a consumer hardware. And so if we find out that ARM it doesn't have to be better. If it can be competitive with x86, then what if Intel decides they don't want to pay AMD licensing anymore and they decide to go with ARM and make a socketable ARM chip? Because Intel has to pay AMD for licensing for 64-bit.
Yeah, no, that's true.
And so like there's no reason it can't be socketable. And so it's just a matter of if the ARM, like the base architecture of ARM, could theoretically be competitive with x86, then that if that is the case, and we won't really know until we see someone go all out on ARM, then that could long term have some pretty crazy implications.
It could, from a pure performance standpoint. I agree. I do think that the compatibility and capability of x86, as well as Intel has consistently added instruction sets like AVX and stuff like that.
I mean, they can do all that on ARM, though.
Yes and no. I mean, ARM doesn't want to have too many instructions because then it starts to lose its entire benefit of efficiency, right? x86 has an insane amount of instruction sets, and that's part of its ability. And so I think it just depends on what the goals are. And if they can, if Apple can get better performance for video editing out of ARM than you can out of x86 on any Windows machine,
that's gonna terrify some companies.
Yeah, right. Like that is still like there will still be a place for x86, I think, for an extraordinarily long time, but it's less, x86 is less specialized and is less efficient. And so for like mobile, ARM all the way. And then for something that is more specific built, I do think it's probably going to be possible to pull more performance out of ARM, either period or for less money than you can out of x86. And so I think Apple is actually going to see the ability to either profit more or potentially sell more performance for less money.
And then another thing too, that would be obviously it's not really a benefit that Apple's going to be able to sell people on because it's only going to be a benefit at massive scale. But ARM is more power efficient for the performance it gets. That's been the case. Like that's why it's got used in mobile over x86. And so with that being the case, if Apple can show that the hardware can be somewhat competitive with x86, again, it just needs to be competitive, and we can start to see more focus from Windows to make ARM work better, and maybe maybe Microsoft has to build their own version of Rosetta to get this type of thing up and running well. But if we can get the bulk of computers onto a more power efficient platform, then globally that helps reduce power consumption. And I mean, ARM chips are crazy. Like, iPad has, jack shit for power consumption, yet it outperforms or power, uh, yeah, power consumption. Yet it outperforms Intel chips that obviously consume quite a bit more power. In some cases,
Yeah.
double, triple. Because even the lower end Intel chips are take what 25 watts sometimes 30 watts.
Well, they have ones that go down to
Yeah, but
5,
those are like the
but
U or the Y or whatever. Those really shitty ones.
oh yeah, they're
Whereas
really
I'm
slow.
talking
Yeah,
like if
no,
you
it's
look at
true.
like the
Yeah.
Macs that run the i3s, you know,
Yeah.
if my iPad can be can consume half the power for somewhat similar performance. Well,
Yeah.
if long term, again, this is not something that would happen anytime soon, but in the context of climate change and switching over our energy systems, if long term we can get a bulk of like consumer computing over a much more
Yeah.
power efficient platform, that helps ease that transition and ease how much we need in power. And as more and more people are using computers, and there are more people that are going to be using computers as developing countries grow, uh,
Yeah.
being able to introduce to them ARM and have them go straight into that would be a good way to help reduce global power consumption.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's already a thing that definitely is reducing power consumption is good no matter
Yeah,
what, right? Like our global power consumption has been on a continual rise for a really long time,
yeah,
and we have to keep up with that one way or another. And potentially part of keeping up with that is not having to keep up with it by using less.
yeah. And
Right.
if we
So,
can like, obviously this is something that most people don't really care about the societal level changes, but like if we can deal with a couple year, even if it's a 5 year annoyance transition to have the next like next 20, 30 years be on a much more efficient CPU architecture, that's going to
yeah.
have GDP advantages, it's going to have spending advantages, it's going to have um, job, like so many different
Yeah.
advantages as far as how we have to deal with global power levels.
Absolutely,
So
absolutely. And I think it's important and you mentioned global warming, and I think that is a factor to play in there too. I think that we have to figure out how to efficiently produce power, because no matter what, our power usage is going to go
yes,
up. But being able to ease that transition is incredibly important, and I think ARM does have the ability to help with that in a lot of ways.
yeah, and in
And we're seeing ARM more and more places in the data center and stuff like
yeah,
that.
and in some regards, actually, I think that the shift to mobile computing, like Apple pushing the iPad to be people's next computer,
Right, right.
is
Which is
kind of another way to achieve that. In that, if people can just
yeah,
get used to using an iPad, then they don't have to worry about the translation layer. They don't have to worry about apps. For certain use cases, you're always going to need that higher end stuff.
yeah,
And so it's good to still try and get that transitioned over. But there's going to be
yep.
some of those benefits come from just getting people to use iPads and stuff.
Oh,
So,
absolutely. Yeah, I think so.
um, there are some downsides to this switch to ARM, though. For one, we don't really know how apps are going to work. Like, are you going to be able to just download apps from anywhere?
Yeah, that's another good question.
I mean, I would assume initially yes. Like, obviously, Big Sur's not going to limit you because the translation layer exists, and that's for x86 apps, which you
Yeah,
don't get from the Mac App Store in most cases. Um,
yeah, that is a concern. Is we have seen moves from Apple before, almost purely to make profit, in terms of, if they were like, oh well, you have to do it through the App Store
yeah,
now, because ARM, like, that's the, oh yeah, you have to give us a 30% cut,
yeah,
and
and
we
the
yeah,
kind of the main thing that makes me think that that's not going to be what ends up happening is this transition period. Because if we already have to have it so that, like, if they could go straight into Big Sur, the first OS that will launch for Macs for ARM, if they could
yeah,
go straight into that with everybody having an ARM Mac, then they could do that very easily. They could just say,
yeah,
this is where you get your apps now. But if you have 2 or 3 years of people getting apps from elsewhere, then people are going to get used to getting even potentially ARM apps from elsewhere.
yep, that's true.
So my hope
So
is
hopefully they
that,
stick with
yeah,
that.
my hope
Yeah,
is that the place you go to download universal apps is the Mac App Store, and that
yeah.
otherwise you can still download stuff as you do now. It
Yeah,
just
yeah,
happens
because
to be
they do
coded
need
for
to be
ARM.
careful about pulling it away from semi-power
Yeah,
users.
and like
because like yeah,
Mac users are already used to downloading the specific Mac version. And so
yeah.
if it's Mac x86, Max, or Mac ARM, it's not that much more difficult.
No, that's
So,
true. That's true too. And I mean, there's auto detection for that kind of stuff to help too.
yeah.
So yeah.
So, yeah, that's really it. That's a big change. It's just a big change that we'll have to wait and see the longer term ramifications of. But that kind of really
Yeah.
wraps up the Apple stuff.
Yeah, no, that was I mean, it's like 2.5 hours or 2 hours of Apple
Oh
stuff,
yeah,
but
and there's so many features. Like if you guys want to see everything, go to the macOS Big Sur preview page, scroll down, and there's an option to
yeah.
click learn more, and it lists a ton of features, and it's not all of them.
Yeah, no, I mean, this software launch is
Yeah,
huge. Yeah,
Apple went
absolutely.
ham this year.